Welcome. Welcome back. This is our final session together in this series. We'll surely have another series at some point in a number of weeks' time. I'm sorry, let me just introduce myself. My name, again, is Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Atid and the Web Yeshiva. Welcome to you from the Beit Agnon here in Jerusalem, both the live studio audience and those of you online. We have been studying over the past 8 weeks, with a little gap between the first 4 and these last 4, a series that we called Nostalgia and Nightmare. Again, that's a title that I borrowed from Professor Arnold Band's work by the same name, that very important book in English on Agnon's writing, where he develops this idea of these two poles, these two themes around which Agnon's writing can be organized: the nostalgic retelling of the old world. But when you start scratching under the surface, you realize that underneath the nostalgia itself, there is some kind of nightmare, the tension of trying to stand on this side of the divide, this side of modernity, and looking back at the old world that the author once occupied, or that we once occupied, or that we're aware was once part of the power of Jewish life, of Jewish culture, of Jewish learning, and to know that we're somehow distanced from it. I remind you that I told you, I think, on that first session, that nostalgia comes from the Greek word, which is related to pain, right? The pain of the memory of what was, and knowing that you can't ever really go home again. You can't ever really go back. And it's the pain of the memory. It's a bittersweet pain, but it's a pain nonetheless. And on the other hand, the pole of nightmare around which the Sefer HaMa'asim, although not only the Sefer HaMa'asim, there are other Agnonian works that aren't technically part of this cycle of stories that we've been looking at, which would fit this theme. And either they're not included in this collection, the Book of Deeds, because they were written after the Book of Deeds was completed, or because they, while similarly dreamlike, surrealistic, meta-realistic, or probably a better term would be magical realism. Right? These stories are realistic in the sense that they take place in our world, but a world in which a kind of supernaturalness has taken over, a world in which the borders between place are broken down. He wakes up one moment in Yerushalayim, and then he goes to shul in Buchach. But he wakes up in Yerushalayim at the time of the writing of the story, maybe in the 1930s or 40s, and when he's gone back to Buchach for Yom Kippur, it's the time of his grandfather, who's long since dead. The breakdown between realms of Kodesh and Hol, of holy and profane. One moment it's Shabbat, and the next minute you realize it's yet Erev Shabbat. Is it Yom Kippur? Has Yom Kippur started yet? And the blurring of all these boundaries of time and place and space, these are the nightmarish themes around which all these stories have organized. So I want to look at these two related stories. I hope you had a chance to take a look at them. What's the organizing symbol of these two stories? The Tallit, and also Yom Kippur. If all of these stories in the Sefer HaMa'asim, or almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them, have as their starting point this sense of trying to get to Shabbat, Pesach. Last week, Lebeit Abba, it's Erev Pesach, or it's Shabbat, or whatnot. So Yom Kippur probably stands as, the most angst-ridden, because it's not merely the preparations of the day. You have to clean your house for Pesach, you have to cook the challah for Shabbat, you have to light the candles, you have to get to the mikveh before Shabbat. But Yom Kippur comes with the necessity to prepare not the house and not the meal, but yourself. For the awesomeness of the day, for the sanctity of the day, and for the work of the day. Yom Kippur is hard work. To stand before God in judgment, and to repent, and to make good, and to improve yourself, etc., etc., etc. So this story, we once a while back, some of you at least, we once did look at Pishnayim, Twofold, the longer story. So I want to start with the other, with another Tallit, which is the shorter story. This story was written in 1951. Oh, I'm sorry, but before we begin, I want to just mention tomorrow night, for those of you that would be interested in such a thing. Unfortunately, folks online, this is not something that's going to be broadcast online. But here at the Beit Agnon, you may not know, but your grandchildren might know. There's this artist here in Israel named Shai Charka. He's an illustrator. He does comics and he does political cartoons. Those of you who get that Makor Rishon newspaper, he does the political cartoons there. So he did this comic book of 3 Agnon stories, which was just released by Shokin. And there's a book launch here tomorrow night, and he's going to be be live illustrating a story. Someone will be reading the story, and he'll be live. So here's an illustration of the Maaseh Ha'ez, you know, the famous story of the fable of the goat. Here again is Maaseh Ha'ez. Some of you, I hope those of you that were with us, see the cameo appearance here of anybody recognize this fellow? Can't see. Let me make that larger. Yeah, Miriam Poland corrected it. It's Fischl Karp. There's Fat Fischl Karp with his fish, and making a cameo appearance in this other story. The book is full of these kinds of there are all these little visual references to other Agnon stories and other events from Jewish history. It's very, very well done. Anybody recognize the boy? Here's the boy. You know the story of the Maaseh Ha'ez, the little boy. He tries to, there's a goat, he follows the goat. The goat has found a magic passageway from Poland to Eretz Yisrael, but it's a kind of one-way passage. He can't go back, and it has to do with the voyage to Eretz Yisrael and the break between the old world and the new. Right? Anybody recognize who he's modeled the boy after? No? No, it's not Agnon. There are other in the other stories. In the other stories, the character looks like Agnon, but here, this character is not meant to be a biographical. It's Sherry. You must get this, no? One of the greatest Jews of the 20th century, Bob Dylan. You don't see that? Hamachona Robert Zimmerman. It is. He admitted it. Okay. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, I think. But it's a nice gift to give this book. You can get it in the bookstores. So another Tallit. So the story is written in 1951. The title, Tallit Acheret. Tallit Acheret. Well, again, a translator has to make a choice, and he has to choose how to translate it. The translator is this was published in the magazine Commentary, which in the 60s and 70s published a lot of Agnon translation. And the translator was somebody named Jules Harrow, who I think he was a conservative rabbi who did quite a bit of translation. He did a fair amount of translation. Oh, right, he did that Sidur. So Tallit Acheret. So he translates Tallit Acheret as another Tallit, but how might it alternately be translated? An alternate or a different Tallit. And the title in Hebrew might be meant to support both meanings, as we'll see. I want to do it quickly. I trust that you've read it by now. If you haven't read it by now, well, we're not meeting next week, so you have time on your hands, and you can read this and that and everything else. About my other prayer shawls, about my other Tallitotai, I've already told. So now I merely add what happened on Yom Kippur with the Tallit, which I had left in the synagogue of my grandfather, Alav Shalom. So right away, we know that the narrator, whoever he is, let's for convenience call him Agnon, although again, I remind you, I told you every single time, the narrator is of course not Agnon. The author is Agnon, even if the narrator seems to be somehow a reflection of the author. Agnon's grandfather is already dead at the time of the story. Alav Shalom. Oh, did I not put up? Hold on a second. Let me just call up a file to the... Yeah, Agnon knew his maternal grandfather. Agnon's maternal grandfather, Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Farb, was a very important figure in Buchach. He was one of the community leaders. Agnon knew him, and he played this maternal grandfather plays an important role. I'm sorry, one second. Let me find what I'm looking for. Oh. Sorry, a file that we need seems to disappear from my computer. Like, give me 1 second to find it. Here we go. Sorry. Here you go. I'm sorry. So there's Agnon's grandfather and grandmother. I remind you, Agnon's father was of Hasidic stock, and his mother was not of Hasidic stock. They were misnagdim, they were opponents to Hasidut, but by the time Agnon's parents got married in the 1880s, things had settled down a bit, that this was not impossible. So this is Agnon's grandfather. You know, in those pictures of old, you had to sit still for a very long time, so you couldn't really smile. So you always looked much more stern than you really were. But Agnon's grandfather, we've met him in other times. Remember when we started, oh so long ago, the first session of Nostalgia, we read that little clip of the boy who goes to his grandfather's house Shabbat afternoon, and he takes a peek inside his grandfather's chumash, hoping that his grandfather's very special chumash. You remember? Yaakov won't be afraid of Esav. And he knew that Yaakov was afraid of Esav, and this always, made him sad. So he one Shabbat, on Shabbat afternoon, he'd go to his grandfather's. Probably is biographical. He would go to his grandfather's to learn with him or to be fahired by him. But his grandfather's napping, and his grandfather had this very beautiful, large, old-style chumash with the mikrot gedolot, and he gives a very nice description of it, and he says he wants to peek inside because maybe in this very, very beautiful chumash, maybe in this chumash, Yaakov won't be afraid of Esav. He said, even though I knew that all chumashim are the same, but still, how could it be that in such a beautiful chumash, Yaakov would still be afraid of Esav? And he opens up and he peeks through and he looks and he sees that in fact it of course is the same as in every chumash, and he busts out crying, and his grandfather comes, what's the matter, and he tells him the story, and he says, my grandfather cried too. And he said, from that point on, I didn't cry anymore because I knew that I wasn't alone in my sorrow. So that I took that passage as like a kind of encapsulation of that theme of the nostalgia of what that was. So that the grandfather appears in many different stories. So he's no. This is the non-Hasidic grandfather. I'm not sure if Agnon knew his Hasidic grandfather. Agnon's father came from a different town, and he moved to his mother's town when they got married, which is where Agnon was raised. I'm not sure if the paternal grandfather, was alive still, or but he does not play a large role in Agnon's life. But Agnon's father did, and Agnon's father was. So he's telling the story. He says, you know, the grandfather's already dead when the story is being narrated. So we know that there's some distance from the narrator to the event. That Yom Kippur, I had a notion to pray with my grandfather. So this is like, you know, like I got in my head I should go to my grandfather's shul. And this we do know. He describes this in the story Hamid Pachat, the kerchief, that Agnon would daven with his father in the Hasidic shtibel, and his mother would go pray in the Beit Midrash with the grandfather because they were misnagdim. So he wants to go to daven in his grandfather's shul. And he goes there and he has this memory of his childhood. He remembers the davening of his childhood. Whenever the cantor wrapped his Tallit, here's the first mention of the Tallit, when the cantor wrapped his Tallit around his face and chanted, Chai Olamim, Chai Olamim, I would be perplexed, for the cantor called to him in a loud voice, even though he was right there. And again, here's a problem with the translation. It's not that the translation is bad, it's just that the translation has to make a choice. In other words, in the Hebrew, you can support more than one meaning. And that's what we've seen time and again Agnon doing, using words to support more than one meaning, to support multiple meanings. But a translator has to make a choice. Is he going to translate it like this, or is he going to translate it like that? So here it's even worse, because in English we have this convention that when we use the third person pronoun, he, if we're referring to God, we capitalize it. So the translator also has to, but in Hebrew you don't need to do that. So you can use a pronoun and be a little coy. Are you referring to he, the cantor, or he, God? So in the Hebrew, this is just a bilingual. You don't have the bilingual edition in front of you, but on the screen you can see the bilingual edition. Kfar b'katnuti, kodem shiadati perush hamilot, keshaya chazan mishalshel talito al panav. The chazan would wrap himself up in the talit. Let me see if I can do this without strangulating myself with this headphone on. Right, the chazan would wrap himself up in the talit, right? Mishashel talito al panav v'omer lechai ha'olamim. Now there's a tefillah that we say on Yom Kippur, Haderet v'ha'emuna, which is actually mentioned in the other prayer. Haderet v'ha'emuna lechai olamim. Abina ve'habracha lechai olamim. In the Sephardim say it every Shabbat, but Ashkenazim we say it on Yomim Noraim only. So this prayer, lechai olamim, chai olamim, he who lives forever. So it's not clear when the chazan, the Hebrew either means when he would say the chai olamim prayer, or the Hebrew could mean when he is speaking to the Chai Olamim, the eternal, meaning God. So intentionally, the Hebrew carries both. So I remember I went to shul, it was even before I knew the meanings of the prayer. But I remember the Chazan speaking the Chai Olamim, or speaking to the Chai Olamim, the one who lives forever, to God. And I couldn't understand. Haiti tohe. I was puzzled. Harehu korelo, v'harehu matsui v'omed alav. Imkein kisui panim lama. So the translator says, I was perplexed, for the cantor called to him, right? In a loud voice, even though he, God, was right there. But in the Hebrew, it could mean that he, the cantor, was right there. Again, the translator is not making a mistake. He's forced to make a choice, one way or another. There's no way to preserve the ambiguity. There's no way to preserve the elusiveness of the Hebrew text in translation. Here we have Rabbi Dr. Jim Diamond, a great translator of Agnon, sitting with us, right? So he's nodding because he knows what I'm talking about, right? Because he's struggling to translate Agnon now. and hopefully in a year or two we'll be sitting here studying the new book that's going to come out with the new translations. But he knows the difficulty of walking this tightrope of trying to preserve the multiple meanings when you're forced to put it into the translation. No, so Sherry asks, well, the translator could have written he capital H / he lowercase. But translators don't do that because that's not how you translate literary texts, right? Because it has to read like a proper text. If he uncovered his face, the whole world would be filled with great joy, such as I felt when I played hide and seek with my father. Meaning, if the cantor would take the tallis off, everybody would be filled with joy. But in the Hebrew, ilu gila panav, what could that be? If God were to reveal his face. So this idea of the chazan with the tallis over his head, singing the song either about the eternal or to and with the eternal, and if there'd be this revelation, either the revelation of the chazan's face, or more likely, if God were to reveal his face, there'd be sason v'simcha, there'd be great joy, just like the joy that the narrator has already fully regressed. The first paragraph starts off, he's an adult. He's already talking about his grandfather, alav hashalom. His grandfather's already dead. Right? But in the retelling, he's already completely regressed because the metaphor of great joy, what is the metaphor of great joy? In other words, like now we would say, like as an adult, we would say, if we do X, it'll make us as happy as blank, fill in the blank. So everybody come up with something. Happy as your wedding day. Happy as the day your first child was born. Happy as when your first grandchild was born. Happy as the day you hit the lottery. Right? What is the metaphor that he uses, or the simile here? As happy as when my father played hide and seek with me. But again, the father is because the father is his father, but the father can also be HaKadosh Baruch Hu, could also be God. And God plays this game of hide and seek with us. And sometimes we think that we catch him, and sometimes he's hidden from us. So that experience is the metaphor that the child narrator uses as the example of great happiness. We used to look for each other until finally I would uncover my face, and then we found each other. Right? You do. I mean, I have a 1.5-year-old at home. Right? So you do. I mean, you know, it's like right out of Psychology 101. You know, you cover peekaboo, you cover your face, they think you've disappeared, and then you go peekaboo. The joy! Like really, that's real joy. How many of us ever experience real joy like that? Right? What? Not since you're one, but that's real, pure, unadulterated joy, and that's the pure, unadulterated joy of revelation. Right? That's the joy of revelation here. Now, this is all reminiscent of a very, very, very important Agnonian text, which is not technically fiction, but neither can it be considered fact. Agnon's, believe it or not, his best-selling work is not a work of fiction. It's Yamim Noraim. In English, it's called The Days of Awe. We just marked last Rosh Hashanah, we marked the 75th anniversary of the publication of Yamim Noraim. Agnon spent about 1.5 years working on, it's an anthology of classical sources on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the days in between, from the Talmud, the Midrash, Hasidut, etc. It was something that he felt very, very strongly about. It's something that he felt was a very important thing that he did. There are a few of his own Divrei Torah hidden away, squirreled away in the work, ascribed to other works. There's a work that he cites called the Kol Dodi, which is apparently his own It's like his nickname for his own things. And it's interesting because there are Haredi works that that cite Agnon's that cite sources from here without crediting it, because it's not proper for a Haredi work to quote Agnon. But in fact, Agnon here and there polished up some of the traditional sources, and you can tell based upon the polishing, based on the fact that they're quoting the source as Agnon had buffed it up a bit, that they're obviously quoting from this work, or they're quoting from this apocryphal work, which was really none other than Agnon's own chidushim, his own divrei Torah that he put in the work. If anybody's interested, there's it's a blog article online that someone wrote that tries to ferret out all this. I can send it to you. It's in English. So in the introduction to Yamim Noraim, not the original edition, but the second edition, and unfortunately in the English edition of Yamim Noraim called Days of Awe, Days of Awe is an abridged text. I don't know, maybe it's got 80% of what's in here, and this section is not translated for some reason. But Agnon says the following in the introduction. This is my own loose translation. The heavens were pure and the earth silent, and all the streets were clean, and a new breeze, or a new spirit, ruach chadasha, wafted in the air of the world. I was a child of but 4 years of age, dressed in holiday clothes. Now again, this is not a piece of fiction. He's writing, whether or not it's historically true is a separate question, but he's writing this in the first person in the pen of the author, not the pen of the narrator. One of my relatives brought me to my father and grandfather in the house of prayer. The synagogue was full of men wrapped in Tallit with silver crowns on their heads, white clothing, and prayer books in their hands. Many candles were affixed to long boxes of sand, and wondrous light and a good smell came from the candles. Remember, they didn't have electric lights, so they'd light all these long-lasting candles, and when the candles went out, it started getting dark and shul. They put them in these boxes of sand, because if the candle tipped, it wouldn't start a fire. An old man stood bowed by the prayer stand. An old man stood bowed by the prayer stand, his tallit hanging down to below his heart, and sweet sound emanating from below his tallit. So the tallit was like over his head, hanging down like this. And I stood in the synagogue window, still trembling and amazed at the sweet voices and silver crowns and wondrous light and honey smell coming out of the wax candles. It seemed to me that the earth I had walked on and the streets I had passed through were nothing but a passageway to this house. And still I did not yet know how to form sophisticated thoughts, and the notion of Hadrat Kodesh, of the sublime holiness, was unknown to me. But there's no doubt that in my heart at that moment I sensed the holiness of the place and the holiness of the day and the holiness of these people standing in the house of God in prayer and song. And even though until that moment I had never seen such a thing, it seemed to me that it was uninterruptible. In other words, he's brought to shul for the first time. He's 4 years old in Yom Kippur. And he thinks, like, this is what shul is. Like, he doesn't realize that it's like one day of the year. Right? He thinks this is what shul is. He thinks shul is Yom Kippur, right? Like at the height. He figures, any day of the year you're going to go to shul, that's what you're going to see. Great joy was in my heart, which clung in love to that synagogue and those people and those tunes. Soon enough, the tune stopped, but still a heavenly echo, a bat kol, was humming until that too stopped. My soul suddenly, like, you walk home from shul on Yom Kippur, at least in Yerushalayim, you walk home from shul on Yom Kippur night, there's something in the air, right? All over you, and not just Jerusalem. Right? So there's that hum. The davening is over, but it's still echoing. But soon enough, that too stops. My soul suddenly protested, and I burst out in tears. My father and grandfather were horrified, and all the people tried to calm me down. I stood bawling with tears rolling down my face. They asked each other, who caused this child to cry? They answered each other, who knows? So in other words, he's initiated into this moment of Yom Kippur, and he assumes that this is it. And then, an hour later, shul is over. And what happens? Oh, you talk about this, you talk about that. Who you voting for? Did you see that headline about Tzipi Livni? Who knows what? Thank goodness the elections are not close to Yom Kippur. You know, there's elections. You heard about that? Now I'll tell you who caused me to cry. At the moment the prayer stopped, the beauty of that moment stopped. Some of the folks lowered their talitot from their head, and some started chatting with each other. Those people whom I loved changed their appearance, ruining the beauty of that place and that day. For that reason, my heart ached, and that is why I burst out in tears. And then he says, that's why for 2.5 years I worked 16 hours a day on Yomim Noraim. And here he may or may not be speaking ironically, but he said, you know, like people had a book like this, like they'd have something to do during the downtime on Yom Kippur, instead of talking Lashon Hara or talking politics or talking about what they're going to eat after the fast or who knows what people talk about. So, right. So at the symphony, you sometimes you don't know when to applaud, right? Because there's that moment of, because in between movements you're not supposed to applaud, and at the end of the piece, and somebody always applauds and you don't know, and it ruins it. So that sense, if we take him at his word, that childlike association with Yom Kippur, that exposure, that first bedrock exposure to what? What is it that so moves him? Holiness, Kedusha, right? That he has this sense that there's something going on here. There's something special. There's something special going on here. Someone asks if the silver crown. No, it's a custom. Some people have this custom to have an atara, a silver crown on their tallit. I think nowadays more, once upon a time I think it was more the Hasidim did it, but now I don't know that it differentiates one group from another, although now you see all types of people. So let's go back to the story. When I entered the synagogue, my grandfather brought his face out of the folds of his tallit and turned here and there, searching out a seat for me in the synagogue, which was already filled with worshippers. Now, you see here in the Hebrew I've highlighted, there seems to be a prevalence of the word makom. I think that it appears 9 times in this 2-page story. And makom is sometimes translated as place, and sometimes makom is translated as space, and sometimes makom is translated as seat. It's never translated as God, because according to the pshat, according to the simple reading of the story, even in Hebrew, makom means place, right? Levakesh li makom. My grandfather's looking. He comes to shul. He comes to his grandfather's shul, and there's no seat for him. But the repetition, makom, 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 eino omer ela darsheni, and it of course draws the reader's attention to this association of makom also being a synonym for, a nickname for God himself. So at the beginning of the story, machmat richuk hamakom, which the translator says because I lived far away from the synagogue. But it also echoes as meaning machmat richuk hamakom, because God was far from me, or because I was far from God. And because of that, he gets to shul a little bit late. He's distanced, physical distance, but also spiritual distance. And that's the theme that runs throughout the story. He is now an adult. How do we know he's an adult? Not when the story is being told, but when the story takes place. How do you know he's an adult when the story is taking place? Because he's wearing a tallis, which according to the Ashkenazic custom, and certainly according to Agnon's custom, you only do after you're married already. So already this is, when he's married, he's already living here. And he has his tallis. But it's Yom Kippur morning, he says, I'm going to daven with my grandfather, which is in Buchach. But within the dreamlike parameters of the story, that's possible. You don't even need a magic transport. You don't need a rabbit hole or a magic cave or whatever. It just works within this story. But when he gets there, he's a child again. Meaning his memories are all, in telling the story, he tells it as if he is a childlike. And that way, that kind of regression that anybody can, when you, I was very fortunate. I had grandparents. I had grandparents, 3 of my grandparents were at my wedding. They saw at least some of my children born. They were a very important part of my life. And I was, some people, by the time we were married, my wife no longer had any grandparents. I never met her grandparents. But I had 3 grandparents that were alive for a good long time. And I'm the eldest in my family on all sides, so that helps in terms of the generations. But, you could be, in your mid-30s with 2 kids. You go to your grandma's house, you're a little boy. It doesn't matter. Hmm? So again, makom, 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 makom. They're trying to find a place. There's no place. There's no space. He doesn't have a place, right? And this consciousness that he, the narrator, has, that there's a distance from the source. There's a distance from God. There's a distance from the world of his grandfather. He gets there. There's no place for him to sit. They try to squirrel him away. He realizes that he doesn't have the Tallit. And then he finds this Libi, this libel, the Tzaddik's son. And just like in Pishnayim, you have this son of the Dayan. The 2 stories have a lot of parallels. He would sometimes do this. He'd sometimes write a story, and it would be like a sketch. And then that theme would be explored in a larger work. Although here it seems to have gone in the opposite direction. The shorter work, the 2-page story, was written about 10 years later. So sometimes you take a theme, and instead of expanding on it, you distill it, and you tighten it, and you condense it. So it seems that in this case, the theme went in that direction. But here's this libel. He's the Tzaddik's son. So again, it's almost like he's with his schoolmate. And they leave shul, as little boys sometimes do, and they go back to Libel's house, and he says, oh, you're thirsty? Here, take a whiff of this. And he takes a pitcher of juice. And he said, well, maybe if you just smell it, it'll refresh you. And stick your head into this bucket of apple juice, and maybe just smelling it will quench your thirst. Have any of you ever fasted? This is not a good strategy. And what happens? I mean, who's this libel? This libel is he's the son of the tzaddik, but he seems that he's a bit of a mischievous troublemaker. I don't know if he's the extension of the Yetzer Hara or the Satan or distraction, like all these other characters we've met in these Sefer HaMasim stories, Mar Gressler and, what were their names? And Anderman or Unterman and Chaim Apropos. You remember all of these fellows from the other stories. They're all somehow the embodiment of temptation or distraction or whatnot, and he seems to be filling that role in this story. But he's putting his head into the bucket of apple juice, and the apple juice starts frothing up. I mean, it's almost something out of, I think of you know, that scene from the Sorcerer's Apprentice. You know, with Mickey Mouse and Disney, and like suddenly he's innocently doing one, and suddenly like it gets out of control, and the waves are washing over him, and he's like drowning in this bucket of apple juice, and it doesn't say explicitly, but what's the implication? That he drinks from it on Yom Kippur, and he's kind of feels guilty about it. What? Well, in other words, like, you know, it's not like, you know, I was innocently standing there when the apple juice, like, you know, fell down my gullet, right? Officer, yeah. In other words, that's the way he's telling it. Here you have the question of the, you know, this theme. I mean, in literature studies, you have this idea of the unreliable narrator. In other words, the narrator tells us the story, and we as readers are generally inclined to take the narrator at his word. But sometimes the author will arrange it that the narrator tells the story in such a way that at a certain point, either from the beginning, or sometimes only on the last line of the novel, do you realize, maybe this narrator wasn't, maybe he was coloring the story. And then you have to go back and reconsider. Can you think of any examples of that in literature? Hillel Halkin's Strange Death. I don't know that, but how does that work? Okay. Holden Caulfield, Catcher in the Rye. You know, told from this, how old is he? He's, I don't know, 16, 17 years old. You know, this, you know, it's the story of teenage angst and alienation and depression and all types of other things. And the story of Holden's escapade is told first person by he, the narrator, Holden Caulfield, but only on the last page of the novel do you discover that it's being narrated from within a psychiatric ward. And then that makes you wonder, oh, wait, I now have to go back and read it all again, because the first reading and then all subsequent reading, if you haven't read it, I've ruined it for you. How could it be that you haven't read it? I mean, it's been around for 60 years. You've had a chance. Okay. So that's an example of the unreliable narrator. So here, the unreliable narrator. So yeah, of course he would. He's trying to convince you that he's trying to do the right thing. So yeah, I mean, I was just sitting there on Yom Kippur with my tongue out and flush. When we reached the synagogue, my grandfather again gave me a troubled glance. Could he have sensed what had happened? I acted as if there was some other explanation. You are upset because I stand here without a tallit. I'll get my tallis, the one that's here in your synagogue, and wrap myself in it right away. I looked up to see if he was satisfied and saw that they had brought benches into the synagogue. So like suddenly there's more room, but it's like a strange kind of scenarios. Again, here's the surrealistic or the unrealistic or the meta-realistic. They bring these benches, they set them up like bleachers, you know, at a hockey game, and there's this bizarre type of character standing there in a baker's hat. There's a small boy. What are they doing? It's not very Yom Kippur-like. No, that's the point. In other words, it's this regression to childlikeness, even though the narrator or the author is conveying to us with the presence of the Tallit that he's not really a child. This whole mischievous thing with his school chum and to his grandfather. Right, well, that's part of the conceit of all of these stories, the blurring of all these boundaries. The story starts in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur. He gets to Buchach. He's in his, how old? Well, the story is written, the story is written in 1951. It doesn't mean the story has to be set in 1951, but nagid that it is. So he's already in his 60s. He's already in his 60s. But even if the story is only set in the 30s, right, the fact that the story is written in 1951 in the absence of any evidence, we don't know when the story is set. But he's an adult, right? He's an adult, he's married, right? He's at least, his grandfather's certainly dead, but in the story his grandfather was alive, right? My grandfather looks at me. Suddenly I reached into a hole in the table and brought out my tallit. I'd often looked for my tallit there without finding it, but now I found it, unless you say that someone else had taken it and then returned it. It's an amazing thing indeed. He can't find the tallit, he looks for the tallit, he looks where it should be, it's not there, and then he goes back and he looks again, and there it is. As I prepared to wrap myself in my tallit, I saw that one of the fringes was missing, right? You know, he has the tallit, he's wrapping himself in it, but one corner is cut off. On each of the four corners of the tallit is the tzitzit. You know, it's prohibited to wear a four-cornered garment that doesn't have tzitzit on it. And he sees it that his tallit is pasul. It's invalid because one of the tzitzit strings is missing. A certain fellow whom we usually ignore, though he never ignores us. Who's that? Who might that be? Oh, it's interesting. Maybe Hashem. I hadn't thought of that. Maybe God. Yeah, maybe the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death, or the devil, or Satan. A certain fellow whom we usually ignore, though he never ignores us, whispered to me, "Your tallit has only 3 fringes." I began deliberating. What is he telling me? Don't I know that a tallit with only 3 fringes cannot be used? Or did he want to remind me of a forgotten tradition? When a man is alive, even though he may be holding a tallit of 3 fringes in his hand, he's not allowed to wear it. But when he's dead, they pursue him with a proper tallit of 4 fringes, pluck out 1 fringe, and force him to wear it. That's the custom, that when a man is buried, he's buried with his tallit. But since lo hametim yahalaluka, the dead do not do mitzvot, right? So they remove one of the tzitzit so that the tallit that the deceased is wearing is no longer valid. So he sees a tallit with only 3 fringes. What is that a symbol of? Death. Depression overcame me, not because of what had been whispered to me, but because of this holy day of Yom Kippur, which had passed by without a prayer, without anything. Al Yom Tov Kadosh Zeh Shel Yom HaKippurim Sha'avar B'lo Tfilah U'V'lo Klum. Right? He's so busy trying to get there, get his grandfather, get the seat, get the tallit, this distraction with the juice. And what happens? Yom Kippur comes, Yom Kippur goes, he misses it. Now, Professor Holtz, who I've mentioned a number of times, Avram Holtz, points out in a rather in an engaging way, in an essay entitled Hachilul HaMishulash, the triple desecration, that the symbols of the story, Yom Kippur, the Beit Midrash. In the Hebrew, it's a Beit Midrash. His grandfather davens in a Beit Midrash, not a Beit Knesset, even though the translator calls it the synagogue. And the Tallit, a symbol of time, Yom Kippur, of place, the Beit Midrash, the synagogue, and of object, the Tallit. All of them have somehow been defiled. And through this defiling, all of these, just like in all of these stories, where time becomes unmoored, where place becomes unanchored, right? So the symbols in the story, each of them somehow becomes defiled. Yom Kippur is desecrated. The Beit HaMidrash is a problematic place. They don't want to make a place for him. Here he is. He's far from the makom. He wants to get back to the makom. And the people in the makom are not letting him in. I mean, perhaps you've heard of such things. You go to shul, and somebody says, you're sitting in my seat. I mean, not in any shul that you've ever davened, but you've heard of such things happening. Not in Yerushalayim, though. And because of this triple desecration, so the day passes without prayer, without klum, without nothing, and he's missed the boat. The idea of the missing the boat is explored in greater detail and more explicitly in the companion story, Pishnayim, Twofold. Yes? His tefillin, yeah, in Mazal Dagim. Right. Except it's true that, I'm sorry, what's your name? Judy points out that in Mazal Dagim, which we read a few weeks ago, we also have this idea of the guy who never gets to shul on time, and the tefillin being invalid, but there it's used for high comic purposes. In other words, he uses similar devices, but for completely different, because of the very, very different nature of that story, he's using it for a very different, literary goal. So, but it's true that these are themes that appear again and again. Altogether, the presence of tefillin as a symbol, Tallit as a symbol in Agnon is important. So someone asks, actually he makes reference to this in the next story, that what's called the Minhag Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem custom, is actually not like this otherwise very well-known Jewish custom. In Jerusalem, they do not bury someone in a Tallit. Why that is may have to do with certain Kabbalistic practices, but it's true that in Jerusalem that's not the custom. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Right. So all of these stories, that's actually last week, the story that we read last week, which was called To Father's House. I mentioned that indeed Agnon was in Germany at the time that his father passed away. He had gone to visit his father for a couple of days and then went back to Germany. And when he gets back to Germany, he gets a telegram from Buchach from Galicia. It's taking a turn for the worse. You better hurry. He turns around, and by the time he gets there, his father had already passed away and been buried, and he gets there for the middle of Shiva. That idea is obviously so. You don't need to be Sigmund Freud to know that this is something that's going to leave its impact on you. And that idea is explored most fully in that story. But in all of these stories, this theme of trying to get something done, trying to make a deadline, they're quite literally a deadline, trying to get to the hospital before it's too late, or to the sick house before it's too late. That's a theme which is explored again and again and again in these 20-some-odd stories in the Book of Deeds. And sometimes it's done in a literal way, trying to get there to his sick father, and sometimes in a very metaphorical way. Famously, what are some of those examples we've seen? No? You have a task. What? Being late for Shabbat, trying to get to the post office in time to mail a letter. Trying to deal with some kind of bureaucracy, dealing with the inanity of the rat in the maze of bureaucracy, having to get your passport stamped, et cetera, et cetera. All of these become symbols for that theme. Right? Trying to eat your meal, I'm just looking at what people say in line, to mail a letter, to catch the last bus, et cetera. Jay? Maybe Ebenezer Scrooge stares into his own grave. The ghost of Christmas future shows him what will be. He'll die a sad and long. Is Ebenezer in fact dead? Well, who has an open grave with a headstone that says, "Here lies Ebenezer Scrooge, Yamach Shemo," right? Only dead people. Except, well, it's only a dream, we suppose, or a vision, but that's, in other words, the fact that he sees his own burial shroud, as it were, does not mean that the narrator is dead. I hadn't considered that. I don't think anybody else does either, but doesn't mean it's wrong. Yeah, but in all of these stories, even stories where it's obvious that the narrator isn't dead, but within the reality of the dreamlike, whether it is a dream or it's merely dreamlike, within the reality of these particular stories, that's okay, right? The living and the dead can occupy the same world, just like Buchach and Yerushalayim and Berlin can occupy the same street. Right, just like in dreams, this happens all the time. Okay. Okay. Did they give it back to you? What cemetery was it? Givachol. Good. Pishnayim. Twofold. This is my translation. This is my translation. And if there are any suggestions for improvement, I welcome them. Harlow. Jules Harlow. Yeah. So now I translated the title Twofold following someone else who gives it that title, but Pishnayim can mean, well, double, but double what? You read the story, you tell me. Well, what are there two of in the story? There are two Tallitot again, and, no, you read the story? What does he really want two of? Two Yom Kippur. Yeah, use a copy here. If you pass this to the fellow in the back. At that hour, I had not prepared myself for Yom Kippur. Again, it's Erev Yom Kippur, he's unprepared. Just like last week, it's Erev Pesach. The week before, it's Erev Shabbat. He's facing the deadline, he's unprepared. On the afternoon before Yom Kippur, towards evening, I went to the synagogue in my neighborhood, and this story seems to be set here in Talpiot. We know that Agnon was a great walker. He loved to walk around Yerushalayim. He would walk from one end to the other. He liked to daven in different places. He liked to go to in the years when the old city was accessible, he liked to go to the old city to daven. He would go daven with the Kabbalists. He would daven with the Sfardim. He would daven with the Italians. He would always like to go to different places. Part of that was, like there were always opportunities to collect stories. He had this interest in the different customs of the different tefillot of the different communities. Upstairs in the library, actually, there's a very, very impressive collection of a wide variety of sidurim, machzorim, etc. He also didn't particularly like the local synagogue. The synagogue here, which is now today called Shai Agnon in his honor, in his old age, he would go there more often because it was harder for him to walk further distances. But he didn't like going to the local synagogue. I guess he didn't, like everybody has a shul they don't like to go to. I guess he thought it wasn't as what he was looking for. But it was also true that he didn't, if he went to the same place every day, he knew that people would hack him. Like they hack him a Chinik, like if they knew, Agnon will be there, I'll go, I'll, he was after all, he was a very famous person. He was, at one period, certainly later in life, he was the most, famous man of letters, man of culture in Israel. And if you knew, like if everybody knew that, Agnon's going to be there every morning at 7:30, staying in Tallit and tefillin, and you could ask him something, you could bother him, you could get him to sign something, who knows why? But he didn't want to go, and certainly not on Yom Kippur. He didn't want to go to the local shul. But this year, since he wasn't prepared, he went to the local synagogue in the neighborhood, unlike every other year when I was accustomed to pray in the city being the old city. So the story seems to be set sometime in the 30s. The story, I think, was published in the early 40s. So let's presume the story is set in the early 30s. In all cases, it's before 1948, so the old city is still open. The Holy One, blessed be He, fills the whole world with His glory. Wherever a man prays, his prayer is desired. How much more so in the synagogue? How much more so in Jerusalem, which is wholly sanctified for prayer? It's true that the synagogues in town are full of pious and perfect Jews who know how to appease their Creator with prayer, and with prayer leaders who pray with special intentions, with kavanot. But I said to myself, who am I that I should seek special kavanot? It's enough for a man such as myself to pray that which is written in the Machzor. And then, for whatever reason, that year he goes to the local shul, and he has this description in chapter 2 of this very empty spiritual experience. Excuse me. You read this story. What symbol, besides the Tallit, what symbols or objects jump out at you again and again? Yeah, okay, but what symbols, what objects appear again and again in the story, in one way or another? When you read, on the first read, you should, just try to make sense of what's written. Since the story is in English, that's not so hard. But on your second read, you'll notice the repetition of motifs or objects, or like in the last story, if you'd read in Hebrew. In English, there's no way to catch it. But if you read in Hebrew, a red light should have gone off. Oh my goodness, there's an inordinate amount of uses of the word, of the noun makom. What does that say? So in this story, what jumps out? Okay, prayer in synagogue, but in other words, if we're talking about the Yom Kippur prayers in synagogue, that doesn't... Well, the Tallit is obviously a central theme. Yeah, obviously central. All right, let's go on. Maybe we'll catch it. And chapter 3. After the prayer, this is Kol Nidre night. After the prayer, I returned to my home. It was not yet 7 o'clock in the evening, and 12 hours more remained until the morning service. What will I do with these hours, and how will I spend them? I thought it over and went out to the roof of my house. So here we are. Here's the house. Here's the house. Here's the house as it looked then. Here's the house as it looks now. The roof of the house. Here you see the house was really quite isolated. This open lot here is occupied by, right, this window here. These windows here are these windows right here behind you. You can turn around and look, right? But now there's a house there. Where that house is, on that side of the building, there was this open lot. And this is looking out of these windows towards the east. He says you could see, no, not the old city, you could see all the way to the Dead Sea. Looking out of the north, here's the little window in the study upstairs. Looking out to the north, you could see all the way to the old city, because these houses and these trees weren't yet built or hadn't yet grown. But you see the house itself. Here's the house. Here's the ginah of the house. Right. This is the north side of the house. This is the east side of the house. And this is the southern side of the house. This is the ginah right out here. But you see that the house, built in the style, the Bauhaus style of the time, has this flat roof. It has this merpeset, this patio up here, and it has a flat roof. And even today, if you go outside, you can see And you can't really see it on this picture, but there's like a little ladder that goes up to the roof. So what does he do? He goes up to the house. He goes up to the roof of the house. In this direction rests the city of God, and in that direction lays the Dead Sea. The moon stood in the middle of the heavens, and all the mountains that surrounded the wilderness sea were covered by the light until the desert thorns could be seen. The most sublime silence rested on everything. Silently I strolled along the roof of my house, gazing now at the mountains and now at the city of God. Pa'amim hibatati el heharim, ufa'amim hibati el ir ha'elokim. In Hebrew it's a rhyme. So he goes to sleep. The next morning he ends up sleeping a little late, just like in the other story. And nevertheless, I arrived late to the synagogue. The synagogue, however, was practically empty. So Sherry asks the question, is this a reference to David on the roof? There are a few good Tanakh scenes of people hanging out on the roof. There are a few good scenes in the Midrash also. So it's good that you catch that connection. But you have to ask yourself, is there something going on here between these two texts? He goes to shul, and it's very depressing. There's hardly anyone there. And the depression leads to distraction. He's looking around. While he's looking at the door, it seemed to me that I was asking to take leave. I removed my tallis and yarmulke, and I left. He steps out of the shul, the end of chapter 5. And he's standing out in the courtyard of the shul. One by one, people start showing up. But you know how people are. You know, Yom Kippur is very long. So, you know, you get there 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later. I mean, it's not like they're going to run out of davening. There's still going to be plenty left to daven. So people come, and they're taking their time, and they're chit-chatting, and they're talking about this or that or the other thing. But from inside the synagogue was heard the Chazan's melodies, those melodies which do not penetrate one's heart. It could be the Chazan's voice is lovely, and his tunes are like those of the other Chazanim, but the heart isn't receptive to them, neither the Chazan's heart nor mine. And now we have the first dream sequence. And the truth is, when the story was first published in its first Gilgul, in its first iteration, the title of the story was not Pishnayim, but it was The Dream, Chalom, HaChalom. I said to myself, perhaps Yom Kippur has not yet arrived. So it's Yom Kippur. Not only is it Yom Kippur, it's already Yom Kippur morning. He's already been to shul for Kol Nidre. He already had his little tiyul, wondering about what's going to be of Yom Kippur up on the roof. The next morning he wakes up, he gets to shul. It's a very depressing sight. He's now sitting out. He's taking a break. He goes out into the courtyard of the shul. He's sitting there maybe, and he's daydreaming or he's dreaming. And in the dream, it's not yet Yom Kippur. Remember the story Hanerot, the candles. The candles are already lit. It's already Shabbat. The sun has set, but yet it's not dark out. Right? This surrealistic, bizarro world. The sun rose to the midpoint in the sky. The pine trees perfumed the hot air, letting off a one-of-a-kind smell. Between them stood the tall, erect cypresses. If you take a walk around the block, you'll see all of these trees. Enwrapped in their shady sorrow. This is the shady sorrow of creatures which God has lifted, yet not raised up entirely to the heavens. I'm not sure. Miriam says he's back in Buchach. I'm not sure. I don't think he ever leaves Yerushalayim in this particular story. I think these are the two symbols that run throughout the story and appear again and again. Trees and shoes. Shoes. There are a number of references to shoes. In chapter 2, the shoes on their feet shone like their clean shaven chins. No, so it's true. But there are all these references to shoes, and there are all these references to the trees. And what are the trees? The trees are these creatures that reach up to heaven, but yet are rooted here on earth. But even though they're very much of this earth, What is a tree? No? No, I don't know. A tree is a heaven reacher, right? A tree reaches up. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. But here it's not a poem as lovely as a tree, it's a prayer as lovely as a tree, right? That the tree, I mean, read that line again. This is the shady sorrow of creatures. He walks around. This is a dream. The pine trees perfume the hot air, letting off one of a kind smell. Between them stood the tall, erect cypresses, enwrapped in their shady sorrow. This is the shady sorrow of creatures which God has lifted, yet not raised up entirely to the heavens. So there are two axes on which the story runs. There's this reaching up while being kind of like grounded down here, anchored down here, and maybe that's the symbol of these shoes. What are shoes? Well, shoes are the opposite of up. Shoes are down on the ground, but yet shoes in the context of Yom Kippur are also somehow like a separation. This is a symbol that Agnon actually uses in a number of different places. Those of you that have ever read Smol Shel Shom, or those of you that will read Smol Shel Shom only yesterday, keep your eye open for the mention of shoes that appear again and again and again in that novel. And the other axis on which the story runs is the axis of time. Right? Here, time moving in one direction. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. That, like we've seen in all these other stories. In almost all the other stories, there's an appearance of a clock or a time or a bell or, right? You know, you have to get there. The post office is going to close. You have to catch the bus. The bus is going to leave without you. Yom Kippur is here, and Yom Kippur only lasts for however long it lasts. And if you don't do the work of Yom Kippur before Yom Kippur is over, before the what's the alarm clock at the end of Yom Kippur? The shofar, right? And oy vavoy, we should hear the shofar without having done what we need to do, right? Yes, he does. He absolutely does. I strolled among the trees, telling myself that Yom Kippur had not yet arrived, but it's on its way, and I must prepare myself for the awesome and holy day. So in the dream that he has on Yom Kippur morning, it's not yet Yom Kippur, so he hasn't missed the boat, so there's still time. Before I could prepare myself, the evening of Yom Kippur overtook me. Not that of this year, not last, nor the one before, but that of the days when I was 7 or 8 years old. So now in the dream, it's Yom Kippur. He's having a dream about Yom Kippur. But he's not having a dream about this Yom Kippur, he's having a dream about which Yom Kippur? What's the Yom Kippur of his childhood? You remember the introduction to Yomim Noraim, the Yom Kippur of that immersion into before the fall, before the disillusion, before the naivete is broken. The Yom Kippur of entering the shul and thinking, this is what shul is? You know that in London they have this program Limud. There's this learning program in London called Limud. It's a fantastic program. It's like a learn fest. Thousands of people come. I mean, they have it now in different places, but in England, it's actually not in London, but it's in England. It's been around for 30 years or so. I was there once. It's a wonderful thing. So someone once told me, someone told me at the time that I was there, that she grew up at Limud, because her parents were original Limudniks, and she used to go. She was a baby, you know, in the Agala. She used to go to Limud, and when she was little, she thought that Limud was a place, and it's a week-long festival, and it's very nice. Jews of all stripes come, and it's learning. It's 24/7 learning, and it's. So she said, I always thought that Limud was there all the time, and just we went once, 1 week a year. Like Disneyland is there all the time, but we go for vacation once a year. And she said, when I discovered that, no, that this really magical experience is only there, for that 1 week, and then it folds its tents, and the other 53 weeks of the year it doesn't exist. She said, I'm so depressed to think that it's not there all the time, because the world needs that. So it's just, I go to shul on Yom Kippur, and I think this is shul. This is what's happening all the time. And he's depressed to discover. So before the disillusion sets in. Yeah, he doesn't refer to it as Kol Nidre here. How I love the night of Yom Kippur. The gates of heaven are open, and God himself, as it were, bows down to hear the prayers of Israel. He needn't bow, since he knows the hearts of every man. But out of affection for the Jewish people, this should be a capital H. This is a mistake. Here the translator's done a bad job. Because here it should be a capital H because there's no ambivalence here. Here the he obviously refers to God. He, God, bows down like a father who inclines his ear to his little boy. So again, like the other story of the hide and seek of the father, but here there's no metaphor. Here it's obvious. The metaphor is explained for us. The father in the metaphor is God. God bows down to hear our prayers, just like a father bows down. Your kid pulls your pants leg, and you bow down to listen to him. Right, so that motion of affection. So that's what praying on Yom Kippur is. At that moment, I saw that father, and that father meaning my father, and all the other folk in the synagogue, whom I thought were all adults, were in fact as small as I and my friends. Except that father and his friends know how to recite the Piyutim with ease and were wrapped in Tallit, while my friends and I only knew a few prayers and how to answer Amen. But when I grow up, I too will wear a Tallit and pray all that's written in the Machzor. Since I recalled the days of my youth, I recalled many things. Each and every matter that I remembered was about Yom Kippur, as if all other days had been erased, leaving only memories of Yom Kippur behind. Like a holy chain of memories, each Yom Kippur was linked to the next, in the way that Yom Kippur appears in a man's dream in order that he repent. So there's two things here. One is he's playing off of all these associations we saw in the other two sections, in the Yamim Noreim and in Tallit Acheret, right? That the up, down, God bowing down, us reaching up, which is of course echoes the image of the tree that he's already painted, right? The tree with its how does that poem go, Rowena? I think I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. No, but there's something about that, how its mouth is pressed against the breast, right? So that the roots of the tree are pressed down to the earth, but yet it's reaching up, just like the little kid. The little kid comes up to you and goes because they want you to pick him up, right? And so that idea that we're reaching up, but God bows down to listen to us or to pick us up. My eldest son is now taller than I, which is very disturbing. I mean, I'm pretty tall. I'm always used to being among the tall. I'm about 6 feet tall, and I was always used to being among the tallest people in the. It's like when I see one of these 7'3" guys. It's always very off-putting. If you're naturally short, I guess you get used to it. I don't know, but so my son is now a good 2 inches on me. He's only 15. It's crazy, but I find it very disturbing. It's there's something wrong with it. They're supposed to be small, but they're supposed to be big. But then there's this other idea of the dream of Yom Kippur. So this is in the sources. The Shulchan Aruch says that if you have the Shulchan Aruch describes. The Gemara in Brachot talks about dreams. We've mentioned this before in other contexts. That that Chazal were aware, without having read Freud's interpretation of dreams, that dreams are somehow the product of your subconscious or your unconscious, even though they didn't use that term. And that if you see certain things in dreams, it's likely an indication of what's going on in your psyche, and it might be an indication that maybe you need to do tshuva, or maybe you need to fix this, or maybe you need to do that. So the Gemara says, the Shulchan Aruch says, that if you have a dream about Yom Kippur at Ne'ilah time, you have a dream of Ne'ilah, the closing prayer of Yom Kippur, or this or that, and there are those that say if you have any kind of Yom Kippur dream, even if it's not a Yom Kippur dream, then you should fast. You should do what's called a ta'anit chalom, something which is not so fashionable nowadays. But Chazal had this notion that if you saw certain symbols in dreams, that perhaps you should undertake a private fast as a way to kind of generate repentance on your part. That having a dream about Yom Kippur might be an indication, even if you have a dream about Yom Kippur in July, right, or in December. Not having a dream about Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur, but if you have a dream about Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur, so then I guess it's a double whammy. But if you have a dream about Yom Kippur, it's an indication that maybe you are in need for a little dose of tshuva. I don't recall how I wound up in. So then he has either it's a second dream, or it's a dream within the dream. And in this dream, or in this second stage of the dream, he's having Yom Kippur now in Germany. Remember, the period of time between 1912 and 1924, Agnon had gone to Germany. While he's there, he gets married, he has 2 children, he encounters Shokin, who becomes his patron, his house burns down, he comes back to Israel. So he has a dream of a Yom Kippur that he spent in a particular German city. I entered the synagogue in Germany and showed the sexton a ticket that I had paid for my seat, because they're yekis, you have to have a ticket, right? You can't just show up. Hold on. I sat in my place. The synagogue was full of distinguished people. Many lamps were lit, and a type of longing and anticipation filled the air. Someone put on his Tallit, reciting the blessing out loud so that others might merit by answering Amen. That's what you do on Erev Yom Kippur. You get to shul a few minutes early, and you wear, normally we don't wear a Tallit at night, but on Yom Kippur you wear a Tallit at night. After him came a second and a third, and the whole congregation, except for one old man who did not put on a Tallit. He said to me, "I'm old and about to die. I'm saving my Tallit to be buried in." So again, the introduction of the symbol of the Tallit as a sign of death. Remember, Tallit Acheret can mean another Tallit or a different Tallit. Either it's the Tallit of life or it's the Tallit of death. Yes, of course, Jim. I don't know. You saw that I skipped that. Yeah. Following this, right. Does anybody have an idea? There's a symbol there, rolling the Torah, but they're doing it upside. The Torah is being held upside down. It's being rolled upside down. I mean, it's obviously not a good thing. It's not to their credit. But beyond that, does it have a specific meaning? I assume it does. I'm not sure what it is, though. So on Kol Nidre night, after the sermon, they stood and they prayed the evening service. In the midst of praying, their size seemed reduced, and they stood small and short, just like Father and the other men in our synagogue on Yom Kippur night. You know, like in a dream, like everybody shrinks down, like Lilliput. And it seemed to me that even he, God, may he be blessed, crouched down to hear their prayers, as it were, like a father who crouches down toward his little boy. As I thought this, I remembered that I'd already thought those thoughts once. Like even we, the reader, know, like, why is he telling us? Like, he already told us this. And he says, like I thought this. And then I realized that I had thought this already. Twice, 3 times before. There are seasons and times. Hold on. Each and every year when a man's thoughts come back and repeat themselves. And then he returns from the 2 dreams. He returns from either the dream, the two-part dream, the one dream. He encounters in chapter 9 well, I'm sorry, I see it's a little bit late, but we'll just try to finish up as quickly as possible. Here's the judge's son, parallel to Libel in the other story. The day begins to pass. Chapter 10. I noticed what was going on, and I told myself that I would enter the synagogue. Today is Yom Kippur, one day of the year. Even if God should grant me many more years, this day shall never return. Yom ze eino chozer. Tick tock, the time is passing. We're moving along on the axis in one direction, and we're about to hit the bell. Just as I wanted to go inside, the whole city peeked through. The sun shone down on the city and the hills, bathing it in glorious glow. Even more so, shone the green dome above the place of the Holy Temple. Remember, before they refurbished the Dome of the Rock, the copper had oxidized, and it was green, like the Statue of Liberty. Right? It was that color. Green being a sign of hope for God's return and rebuilding. Just below it stands the western wall, where I can always find multiple minyanim. At that moment, I wasn't there, and it appeared to me that neither was any man. And so he's here, but somehow he gets this kind of bird's eye view of everything that's going on in Yerushalayim. At that moment, I wasn't there, and it appeared to me that neither was any man. The Holy One, blessed be He, stood there asking about us. What's with them? Why haven't they come? Can you imagine, it's like the biggest guilt trip of all. It's not just like, your old Bubba saying, how come you don't come to visit? You could pick up the phone and call. Right? It's Yom Kippur. He usually goes to the kotel to daven. But what if he's not the only one that was lazy that year? What if everybody was lazy? What if there's no one at the kotel davening? And God is sitting there going, no? Where are they? The heavens stood silently, and noiseless sound was heard from the firmament. This is the sound of the scales weighing out good deeds versus sins. Opposite came the sound of Jewish prayer from the synagogues and study halls in the city. Almost an hour's walk separates the city from my neighborhood, and the city sounds can't make their way out to here. Yet, on that holiest of days, wherein the whole world is at rest, the city sounds can be heard. I inclined my ear and heard them reading the day's Torah portion. And more than could be heard from below was heard from above, the earthly and heavenly Yom Kippur. Just like we have this notion of the Yerushalayim Shel Mala and the Yerushalayim Shel Mata, the heavenly Jerusalem, a kind of idyllic Jerusalem which corresponds to our sometimes less idyllic this worldly Jerusalem. There's this notion of an ideal, a platonic Yom Kippur where it all works. And our Yom Kippur down here where sometimes we mess it up. So he decides this is it. Time is ticking out. I'm going to go back to shul. I'm going to get my talis, and I'm going to take my talis, and I'm going to run to the old city, and I'm going to do it. I still have time. I can make it happen. But what happens, of course, he can't find his talis. He goes and he can't find his talis. What? Hey, there's this whole bizarre scene with the yarmulke and with the paper yarmulke. He goes into shul. It's Yisker time. He can't find what he's doing. Maybe someone else is wearing. It's always a very disturbing thing in a dream, like that kind of doppelganger. Maybe there's somebody sitting in his place wearing his talis, but it's not him. I placed my hand on my heart. Here's one of the most powerful lines. Chapter 12. I placed my hand on my heart and felt and saw that between each beat, time was running out. You feel your heartbeat. You feel that time is running out. One who needs to travel at sea and sees the ship about to set sail when he reaches the port and sees his passport is expired will understand my anguish. I broke out in a cold sweat, and the heat that had previously cheered me abated and left. My mother-in-law is here. She's going to America in 2 nights, right? So she's already worried that her passport, just reading this, she's anxious, right? She's going to go home and check that the passport is still, everybody's experienced that sense, you get there, you see the train pulling away from the station. Right? You're either on it or you're not on it. And that's it. The Yom Kippur ship is sailing. And he gets there and he realizes his passport is expired. He's not going to be able to go. The temperature changed and the tree shadows grew long. Again, the trees. I raised my eyes in prayer and beseeching. I remembered that I have a tallis at home. Not just one tallis, he has two tallisim. One is a German tallis. He tells a story that they sent a Sefer Torah, and the Sefer Torah was wrapped in this tallis from Germany. And the other is the tallis of Jerusalem, the tallis that he wears when he goes to Yerushalayim. What's the German tallis? I mean, you have the German tallis and the Yerushalayim tallis. So again, Tallit Acheret. Which one? What are they symbols of? Past and present, the diaspora and Israel, exile and redemption. What's the tallis that he saw when he was in Germany? Life and death. Because remember, in Germany, the guy says, I have a tallis, I'm not wearing it, I'm saving it to be buried. He's a yekke. Those yekkes, they have it all ready. The funeral is already prepared. Everything but the corpse. So he tells you, even though I live in Yerushalayim, and that's not our minhag, but he knows that it's a symbol. So he's perseverating over these two talis. Just take one already and get going. But he's perseverating over these two talisim. First, he can't find the one in the shul. And now he knows he's got two at home. Right? One is the talis of this and one is the talis of that. And he can't make up his mind. And because he can't make up his mind, I measured out everything that happened and everything that should happen. So I waited in my mind like a pharmacist who measures out medicines for a patient and then is informed the patient has already died. He's a Jewish Hamlet, Sherry says, right? He's perseverating, he can't do it. Meanwhile, the day passed, the sun set, the whole world fell silent. I held my breath and didn't move a muscle so as not to disturb the silence at the moment of judgment when the multitudes above and below are awaiting their verdict, whether to life or to death. That's why I assume that the symbol of the tallis is life and death. Suddenly I heard a shofar blast following Yom Kippur, and I knew Yom Kippur had passed. So then he gets this idea. There is an idea mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, that maybe you could have two Yom Kippur. Just like all the other Yomim Tovim, all the other Jewish holidays, at least in Chutz La'aretz, you have 2 days. 2 days of Sukkot, 2 days of Pesach, etc. Because of the dynamics of Sveika de Yoma and Chutz La'aretz and the calendar and etc. We won't go into all of that now. Yom Kippur everywhere is only 1 day. But the Shulchan Aruch says it could be that there were some people that had 2 days of Yom Kippur. But the second day of Yom Kippur wasn't like a full day. It wasn't really Yom Kippur. It was just kind of like a kind of Yom Kippur. And the Shulchan Aruch says you really shouldn't do it because it's dangerous to fast for 2 days. It's crazy. But he says, I'm aware there is such a notion. So maybe I could have a second Yom Kippur and do it and try to get it right the second day. Long story short, that doesn't work out so well for him either. Because Yom She'over Eino Chozer. Right? You can't, somehow you can't do it. And he says, even though I've had many other Yom Kippur in my life, many years have passed since that Yom Kippur. And then there's a scene with the trees. On the day that he's trying to do his second Yom Kippur, he looks out into the garden, he sees the trees. And what's the tree's job on the day after Yom Kippur? Yeah, they also have a mitzvah. Those trees, they're always reaching higher and higher. They also have a mitzvah. They're meant to be built into the sukkah. You take the branches, you put them on top of the sukkah. And normally, patish, masmer, nikach, maher, right after Yom Kippur, you start building your sukkah. But he's not, because for him it's day 2 of Yom Kippur, and the trees are kind of like saying, no, what about us? So he knows that even the attempt to do more Yom Kippur comes al cheshbon something else. Many years have passed since that Yom Kippur, some like this, some like that. I neither complain nor am annoyed. God knows whether for good or for better. A person lacks many things. As time passes, so do the things he lacks. But you cannot compare that to someone who's missing a day. How much more so Yom Kippur? If only I hadn't delayed and had taken one of the two Tallitot, perhaps I wouldn't be in this state of deficit. If a person has two, the final lines of the story, if a person has two of the same thing, that's probably also an inaccurate translation. In Hebrew, it's Shnei Dvarim Shavim. Two equivalent things. If a person has two equivalent things, while taking one he thinks of the other, while taking the other he thinks of the first, and his heart is split and his mind confused. But I, in his blessed mercy, when I wrap myself in one tallit, my mind is at peace. But sometimes it seems as if I'm standing on Kippur at nightfall, as the gates are closing and the day's soul is about to depart, and a day which passes cannot be returned. And then the story ends on this kind of rabbinic note. In rabbinic texts, you don't write at the end. Say, tam v'lo nishlam. Nishlam v'lo nishlamu rachamei shamayim. The end of the story, but thankfully not the end of heaven's mercies. So when you're like standing in the middle, like deliberating between this and that, think now let's just try to summarize all of these stories. Deliberating between past and present, past and future, the exile and the return, tradition and modernity, commitment and secularism. And all of these themes that are explored throughout all these stories never resolved one way or the other. Think of the image of the bridge. The quaking, shaking bridge of El Harofeh, of the Neirot, right? And you're threatened to be washed overboard, right? And you're trying to get from here to there, but you can't get to either. And you're stuck on this quaky, shaky bridge between these forces that are pulling at you, right? Like the tree reaching up, but yet rooted down, trying to go one way, but pulled in the other, rooted here on earth, but with shoes on our feet that kind of separate us. Think of the halacha in the Beit HaMikdash. Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe. If you're standing on holy ground, you take off your shoes because you don't want the barrier between you. But the story is all about shoes. It's all about barriers. It's all about, you're trying to get there, but you can't get there. There's something blocking you. There's something stopping you. You missed the boat. You missed the bus. You missed the train. You got there on time, but your passport was expired. Right? That's the condition of the encounter between the different worlds. I don't know about us. We live in a postmodern world, and we like to delude ourselves into thinking that we've kind of figured it out, whether we're dati'im or we're chilonim or we're something in the middle or we're something to one extreme or the other, right? It's elections. Everybody's trying to figure out who you are. Like, did you all take that test? Right? You took the test online. You answered 10 easy questions, and they'll tell you who you have to vote for, right? Which is very silly, as if each of those 10 things are equally weighted, as if your position on whether Haredim should go to the army, yes or no or indifferent, is weighted equally with how strongly you feel the threat of Iran getting a nuclear weapon is. These are all very important things, but when we put them together into the cholent that is our identity, they don't all necessarily weigh out in the same way. You put meat and potatoes into the cholent. They each serve a function, but the meat has a stronger flavor. It influences the whole thing in a different way. So all of the different components of one's identity in the very, very complex world that was the 1930s and 40s here in Yerushalayim when these stories are being written are all given expression either through the mechanism of a dream or through the mechanism of the subconscious or the unconscious, or through the mechanism just of literature. We don't have to believe, as Gershom Scholem wanted to suggest, that these were Agnon's actual dreams. And all of these tensions, they're built in. They're not resolved. Life in the modern world, particularly for someone that has at least 1 foot, or merely 1 foot, rooted in the world of tradition, is going to be one fraught with angst, with tension, with questions of identity, with questions of temptation and distraction and all of these things. We're each going to leave here and encounter our own Mar Grafler with his 2 horses pulling a carriage. Or Chaim apropos is going to come along and he's going to distract us from the important things. Sometimes the distractions are meaningless and harmless, and sometimes they're really quite earth-shaking, and they prevent us from being who we need to be. And these are the themes that run throughout. These are the themes that run throughout the Sefer HaMaasim. The degree to which those issues were pressing and urgent in the 1930s and 40s. And to think that many of these stories were written even before the Holocaust, long before the Holocaust, and certainly those that were written after. The degree to which they still are relevant to us is, I think, quite alarming. Because on one hand, we like to think that we, kind of like live a peaceful existence, and in many ways, of course, our lives, I can only speak collectively, of course, everybody individually is his own individual story. But the Jewish people today, certainly, I mean, things are really quite good for us. But you can't compare our situation now, even with Iran, to Germany 1937. I mean, you just can't. There's always going to be some kind of existential threat, but the degree to which these issues are still pressing for us is really quite disturbing, despite how, globally speaking, things are good. And that has something to do with the fact that we still live with these tensions. Each of us, every Jew who is engaged with Judaism, I'm not speaking about religious terms or party affiliations or denominational affiliations, but any Jew that lives in the modern world with some level of engagement with his or her Judaism is going to be plagued, affected, impacted on by all of these issues to one degree or another, in no less a pressing way than Agnon describes of 70 and 80 years ago. I think that is something to give us pause. I don't want to end on a depressing note, but it's challenging. It's challenging. I'll take questions in a second. We'll restart the sessions. If anybody here is new and you're not on the email list, give me your email so we can let you know about future sessions that I'll be getting. But I'm particularly interested. We've now had, I don't know, I put it up in the chat. If you go to webyeshiva.org/Agnon archives, you can get all of the archives of all of the sessions we've done here over the past, I think, 4 years. There's about 50 hours of classes up there now. And you can get, in other words, you get a recording that looks just like this, or just the audio, and then you can also, of course, download all of the materials. But I'm interested in some feedback on not whether or not we should proceed, but in what format to proceed. These kinds of, little series where each week we have a different short story. My preference would be to, in the future, to take a novel and to explore a novel in depth over a number of weeks. But I know that requires a greater commitment on people's parts, and people are not always interested in doing that. So But I'm interested in your feedback on how to proceed, and know that here in the Beit Agnon, they'd be happy for your feedback as well. What? Which novel? I'm open to anything, but we could talk about. Even the shortest novel is still. So thank you all very much. And I'm saying there are questions. I'm happy to stay and answer questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hmm? I'm sorry, say again? Yeah, on Motzei Yom Kippur you say Kiddush Levana. I know, but you don't say it on Rosh Chodesh. The first, you say it on the Motzei Shabbat. Usually you say Kiddush Levana on Motzei Shabbat after Rosh Chodesh, but the month of Yom Kippur you delay it to Motzei Yom Kippur. So that's the custom. Right.
Just a couple of typos. I don't know what that
So do me a favor, just email it to me. I can't. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'll fix it, but yeah, just drop me an email. Hi. Sure. Right. Right. He has this. Also, this chain. Right. There's the chain of Yom Kippur, but there was a link missing in his chain of Yom Kippurs. So I think.
It was okay. Like he could in some way always go back to that space because it's the same day. It's just
No, I think the exact opposite. There's a line here where he says that it's the. Yeah, here, just jot it here on the back of. Yeah, you can jot your email here. There's a line here where he has this idea about the chain of Yom Kippur, that this Yom Kippur joins the last Yom Kippur, joins the previous one. But I think that's the point he's making, that this year, where he messed up, there's a link in the chain that's missing, or that's weak, or that's whatnot. That he can't. He goes, he says, this deficit. I have this deficit on my. Yeah, right. The Yom Shover Eino Chozer, the day that passes, you can't go back. The time moves, and even though memory works that way, but in reality, time moves in one direction. And if you miss it, it's like missing the boat. The boat sails without you. DINITZV at NetVision. Okay, great. Do you want to give me your email? So. Right. 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 I'm just looking at some of the chats here. And Sherry asks about the chazan throughout the story. I mean, okay.